Anyway, let us see if they hit the correct link, it'll show here. And we can go ahead. As it is, we have only 40 minutes. Yeah, Chandana is also here. So Prushni Yadav is here. Chandana is here. All right. Chandana is having a problem. Right. So let's get on with it. What we basically need to understand is the fact that when people talked about the commons, they were not talking about, they were basically, I'm sorry, having a bad throat still. Thank you. Okay, so we are looking at a situation where the properties held by the kings were called the commons, but they were not, they didn't belong to the common people, and I gave you the reasons. So let's leave it at that and let's proceed further. Now you would see that there is no one dynasty ruling England continuously over a long period of time. Possibly the present dynasty, which is the Hanoverians, is the one which is the longest uh, ruling dynasty in England. But you'll see everywhere, including uh, India, that dynasties don't last for a very long time. Not too many dynasties last for a very long time. So you have this period, except the Mughals. The Mughals were the ones who lasted quite some time. But otherwise, you take the Kakatiyas, not a very long time. The Vijayanagara Empire of Krishnadevaraya, not a very long time. So if you look at all these, it shows that, dynasties have a tendency to change, and that is because of wars, usually. Now, the parliament and the king, I told you when we were talking about the Magna Carta, they reached some kind of an understanding about the collection of reviews. They reached some kind of understanding about the collection of revenues and the collection of these revenues was for the betterment of the people. But again, over a period of time, you would see that the kings became greedy. What they signed in the Magna Carta remained only a signature. They became greedy. They started putting pressure on the feudal lords for the collection of taxes. It was at this time that the knights who constituted the House of Commons, they were more successful in collecting taxes than the lords. The reason was simple. The knights saw themselves as servants of the king. Okay? The knights basically saw themselves as the servants. When we say servants, it's not, don't look at it as in the pejorative sense of the term, which is a servant is a lowly being. It isn't that. You say government servant. An IAS officer is a government servant. Okay, I'm a government servant. So they saw themselves as servants of the king, which means they worked for the king. Whereas the other peerages who didn't sit with the knights in the parliament, which is why it became bicameral or at two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. These people saw themselves not as servants of the king. They didn't see themselves as the servants of the king. I want you to keep this in your mind because as we go through with the history of how we had various people, how we had various people, uh, what should I say, uh, various dynasties changing and conflicts between the parliament and the kings. This is a point that you have to keep in mind. Okay, and it becomes all the more important when it comes to the Hanoverians. But it'll take a little time for us to get to the Hanoverians. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the dynasties which is important, not because it was a powerful dynasty. Normally, when we say some dynasty is a very important dynasty, you say that because it is a powerful dynasty. For example, when you talk about the Tudors, Tudors, when we talk about the Tudors were a very important dynasty because they were very powerful kings. But the dynasty that I'm going to talk about with you right now, and this dynasty has some kind of, sorry, this dynasty has some kind of implications. Okay, it has some kind of implications for the rule of the for the rule of England. This particular dynasty was called the Lancastrian dynasty. Okay, they belong to Lancaster. Lancaster is a territory which is even today there in England. So the Lancastrians, Lancastrians, the Lancastrians were a weak dynasty. Okay, they were a very weak dynasty. So automatically, I'm sure the question that comes into your mind is, why are we talking about a weak dynasty? The answer is very simple. Because every time England had a weak dynasty, every time when England had a weak dynasty, it basically meant that the parliament became powerful. The parliament gained a great deal of power. And initially, when the Lancastrians were ruling and when they were not very assertive, when they proved themselves to be a weak kind of dynasty, it was the House of Lords which appropriated most of the powers of the parliament. It appropriated a lot of powers to the parliament and specifically to the House of Lords. They didn't care too much about the Commons. They wanted to basically enrich themselves. They found that there was a way of uh, establishing their control over the ruling of England uh, as much as that of the king, perhaps. So what you find is the parliament appropriates to itself. The parliament here is the House of Lords. It appropriates to itself a number of powers which didn't exist before. These powers were all with the kings, not with the parliament. But the weakness of the Lancastrians is what made the House of Lords very powerful. I am not talking about the House of Commons because, like I said, the House of Commons was where you had the knights. I told you how people are knighted, and I really wish I kept that. I could somehow get that picture of Lewis Hamilton, the Formula One driver, being knighted, going down on the right knee with the sword on the left shoulder, which is what uh, Prince Charles was doing. I really wish I could get that photo. I'll try and get it. If I can, I'll show it to you tomorrow. I'll search for it today. So you see that there is this increase in power of the House of Lords, and that happened because they usurped a number of powers from the kings. But the knights who saw themselves primarily as servants of the kings, they became knights because the king made them into knights. Because of that particular thing, you basically see that there is somehow a reluctance on the part of the knights and the House of Commons to usurp powers of the kings. They were loyal to the king, which was not the case with the lords and the House of Lords. They were not loyal. They saw an opportunity, they took the powers. So you see the House of Lords. So if you read any book, it will say the parliament became more powerful, uh, which is not very true, because if you say the parliament became very powerful, then you're also talking about the House of Commons also becoming very powerful, which is not really what happened. It was the House of the Lords that really became powerful. So they enjoyed themselves while the Lancastrians were ruling. But what you have to understand is that the Lancastrians, because of their own weakness, because of the fact that they were not an assertive dynasty, they didn't last for very long. They collapsed. The Lancastrian dynasty collapsed, and in its place, you have the Tudor dynasty, Tudor. The Tudor dynasty takes its place where the Lancastrians originally were. Now, the Tudor dynasty is, or rather the study of the Tudor dynasty is something which is very, very important, not just in terms of the history of Britain, in the history of the Constitution of Britain. Like I told you, it's not entirely unwritten. There are written documents, a few documents, not many. So while the Lancastrians were in power, the House of Lords, in order to cement their own power, they created certain documents which made so that, you know, later on they could flash that in the faces of the kings and say, we have all these powers. So when the Lancastrians collapsed and when the Tudors took over, a fresh bout of fighting between the House of Lords and the Tudors began. And like I was saying, the Tudors are extremely important, not just from the point of view of British history or English history, from the point of view of the constitutional history, because they basically nullified a number of things that the House of Lords tried to write down as the power of the House of Lords itself. They nullified all that. So you'll see that the Tudors were a completely different cup of tea. They weren't anything like the Lancastrians. This was a very, very powerful dynasty, and it was hell-bent It was hell-bent on establishing its power, stamping its power over England. That is one side of it. The other side of it is that it is the Tudor dynasty which is responsible for one particular puzzle that I talked to you about. I told you the Renaissance, the rebirth of the knowledge of antiquity, or the rebirth of the knowledge of ancient Greece, and to a certain extent Rome, that happened in Italy. But apart from the rebirth, nothing much happened in Italy. Okay? In other terms, if you look at the Reformation, which followed the which quickly followed the Renaissance, Martin Luther was a German, and he was somebody who was instrumental in breaking the power of the Roman Church and creating this whole idea of Protestantism and Protestant churches. The interesting thing about Martin Luther is that Martin Luther what he did led to the creation of a number of Protestant churches. Till then, there was only one church, which was the Roman Church, the St. Peter's Cathedral in the Vatican. But with Martin Luther, you see, there were different kinds of denominations of churches that came up. For example, the Lutherans came up in Germany. The Puritans came up in England. We'll talk about them very briefly, possibly tomorrow. The Presbyterians in Scotland, the Calvinists in France, and if you look at churches in India, if you're a Catholic, there is only a Catholic church, one Catholic church. But if you're a Protestant, there are all kinds of churches. The Methodist Church, the Wesley Church, the Baptist Church. So, Protestantism brought a multiplicity of churches, which itself had various different consequences for the people, most of which can be seen as positive and not as negative. And the biggest answer, the answer to the biggest puzzle, okay, Renaissance happened in Italy, but then what happened after that? Nothing happened after that. Machiavelli, he tried creating a nation state, or rather, he tried creating one principality instead of several in the case of what should I say? In the case of Italy, it didn't happen. Machiavelli was only partially successful. We'll talk about Machiavelli later. We'll talk about him in the Western political thought classes. Uh, and if you look at what happened in Germany, well, you'll see this multiplicity of churches in Germany, and later on, this multiplicity of churches went to France, went to England, went to Scotland, went to Ireland, went to the Netherlands. But what is it that they succeeded in bringing about? I told you the German sociologist Max Weber talks about what he calls the Protestant ethic. The Protestant ethic changed Europe according to him. The death of feudalism and the birth of capitalism is something that happened because of the Protestant ethic, as far as Max Weber is concerned. Now, at this stage where we are talking about various things, I will not talk about the developments that capitalism and all those are. I'm not going to talk about those immediately. I will talk about them a little later. But you must understand, capitalism did not come up in Germany. Capitalism did not come up in Italy. It came in England. The effects of the Protestant ethic were felt in England. They were not felt elsewhere. They were felt in England, and England became the seat of Protestantism. So much so that England created a church which rivaled the Roman Church. The Roman Church was, like I told you, was called the St. Peter's Cathedral. That was the seat of Christianity for all. But the Tudors in England created a rival church to the Roman Church, and this particular church came to be called the Anglican Church, because the people who were ruling England at that time were the Anglo-Saxons. Since the Anglo-Saxons were ruling at that particular time, you will find that this church came to be called the Anglican Church. And funnily enough, the head of the church was the king, not the pope, not somebody from the church. Okay, the notional head was the Archbishop of Canterbury, but the head of the church was the King of England, which is what continues till today. The Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church became the seat of Protestantism. Okay, it became the seat of Protestantism, and it rivaled in religious terms and in non-religious terms the Roman Church. Till then, the Roman Church was simply called the Roman Church. But because of the formation of the Anglican Church and the power that it had, the Romans decided to call their church the Catholic Church. Catholic, by the way, is not a religious term. The meaning of Catholic is that which includes everything. All inclusive is Catholic. Similarly, secular does not mean, does not have anything to do with religion or that which is not religion. Secular also means all inclusive. If you read industrial reports, you'll say the software sector gained in terms of exports. The automobile sector didn't do too well this year because of the fact that there is a shortage of semiconductor chips which are necessary for automobiles. So it didn't perform very well. So you take various sectors like this and you say the secular growth of the Indian economy is, say, at sometimes it is 7%, sometimes it's 8%. This year, I think it's around 6%. Okay, so that is secular, which is all inclusive. Funnily enough, Catholic and secular, both the words mean the same thing. Because the Roman Catholic Church took the word Catholic, because it took the word Catholic, what happened is that that became associated with religion. But you can use Catholic outside of the context of religion even today. Similarly, secular. Secular became non-religious. It became non-religious. Okay, so two words that mean the same thing, one taken over by the church and the other one taken over by the Protestants who said, you want to practice religion, do it at home. Don't bring it out into the streets. So that is the meanings that they got. And the reason why all this happened is because of the Tudor rule. So I'll stop here today. I told you classes are 40-minute classes. I'll stop here today. Tomorrow, we will look at uh, how the Tudors managed to do all these things that I talked about today. So thank you very much. Very kind of you to have attended the class, despite the fact I didn't come in the morning. Not feeling very well, but I don't want to lose the momentum, and therefore I basically decided that we should have a class at least in the evening. So thank you. I'll see you on Monday morning, and tomorrow is Christmas. Enjoy Christmas. Merry Christmas to all of you, and have a good time. even if you're not a Christian. Have a good
Thank you,
time.
sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Merry Christmas. And on that note, I'll say bye to you today. See you on Monday in class in the morning and in the evening here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Bye bye.